You know, one of the places I love to go here on Seize the Day is a place we call our Conversion Corner. Ah, yes, our Conversion Corner. It's a place where we go where I like to say we meet people who maybe never dreamed they would darken the doorstep of a Catholic church, and yet they are Catholic today. Well, joining us in our Conversion Corner this morning is Keith Nestor. Keith is a former Protestant minister here to tell us about his journey into Catholicism. Keith, good morning. Welcome, my brother.
Hey, Gus, how you doing today? Good to be here.
I'm better than I deserve. Keith, how are you?
I'm doing fantastic.
Praise God.
It's we're nowhere near hurricane weather like you were talking about, but we're doing great out here in Iowa.
Oh, good. So you're right there in the middle of the country in good old corn country in Iowa. Well, Keith, I tell you, I saw your story, and as soon as I saw it, I thought I told Scott, my producer, I said, we've got to get this guy on the show. It's a really fascinating story. We do this Conversion Corner rather regularly, and it's always interesting to me to have a chat with especially former Protestant ministers who ply their trade, make their living, if you will, feed their family from, what they do with their faith life and what happens when they decide to become Catholic. So that's kind of the big story. But let's go back and fill in some blanks here. If you would, I always like to start a story at the beginning. So tell me a little bit about little Keith and, what your life was like as a kid and especially growing up in the world of faith.
Sure. Well, so my father is a retired United Methodist pastor. So I grew up in the church. That was our family life, and I had what I would, consider my salvation experience at church camp when I was 10 years old. Altar call, come down front, pray the prayer, receive Jesus, and did that, and that was, a huge moment in my life, and that was basically what shaped who I would become. And then through high school and stuff, I was really into playing music, and that was the pursuit that I was after, and that led me kind of in different places around the country. Wound up in Philadelphia, and I was going to a non-denominational church out there, and while I was out there, I had this experience where I felt like the Lord was calling me to give more of my life to Him, and even if that meant, putting the music aside. So I had another, mini conversion where I did that, and it was not long after that where I was invited to become a youth pastor in a Methodist church back in Iowa. So I went back to Iowa, and this was like 1995.
Okay, Keith, let me go back. Let me go back and fill in some blanks,
Sure.
if I may. I got questions for you. Okay, first of all, tell me a little bit about when you say you were into music. What kind of music did you have a rock band? Were you doing country music? Was it Christian music? What did you do?
It was rock. Okay, so I'm a drummer, and that's what I've been doing. And mostly rock, heavier stuff. I like to play, the kind of music I listen to. I like heavier stuff, and really that was what I was into. So been in lots of different bands and that type of thing.
Now, what did your dad, who was a Methodist minister, what did he think about your foray into rock and roll? And it sounds like you wanted to do rock and roll for a living, right?
Oh yeah, definitely. That's all I thought about. That was my whole desire was to do that. And my parents were always supportive of me, but at the same time they thought I was a little bit crazy. They didn't quite understand what I was trying to do. My dad is a very academic kind of person, and wanted me to finish my degree. And I actually dropped out of college the first time. I did finish eventually, but dropped out of college the first time to move out to Las Vegas to be in a band with some guys. And so they were supportive of me, but they thought that what I was doing was a little bit crazy.
Okay, so tell me then about sort of your spiritual life. Now, obviously being a PK, right? That's what you are, a PK.
Yep.
And by the way, for our Catholic brethren who don't know what that means, PK is a term used for preacher's kid or pastor's kid, oftentimes in the Protestant world. And oftentimes PKs, not always, but oftentimes I think I've found, they become rather rebellious. They kind of go off the reservation, want to try to find their own way, etc. Was that your path, Keith? Did you always go to church during your rock and roll days? What did your faith life look like at this point?
Well, I don't think I really went through a huge outward rebellious phase where I was like into partying and all that kind of stuff. I mean, I loved God. I would consider myself a Christian all the way through all these things. I was just really into what I wanted to do, but I wasn't really like, hey, let's have this party hardy lifestyle. I didn't care about that. What I cared about was music, So for my faith, I sort of had a nominal faith experience when it came to church, because I didn't think that going to church was really that big a deal, Gus, at the time. I mean, I came from the school where, the church my parents went to was okay, but it was kind of boring for me. So I would bounce around a lot, even when I was in high school, to go to different churches, or I just wouldn't go at all because I didn't really feel like it was that necessary. I had my Bible,
sure.
I had my beliefs,
Okay, so tell me then about this idea, because you said that the church that I guess your dad was the pastor at, your folks went to, was kind of boring. You didn't really get into that. Did you, first of all, what was that like? And did you ever go through a period, Keith, where you were, because there are an awful lot of Protestant churches where, hey, a drummer could come in real handy, I mean, they have really great bands, et cetera. So did you ever go on a search for like a church? Did you ever consider using your drumming skills in that capacity? Did you do that? How did that all work?
Well, where I was going to church, okay, so it was kind of a mainline denominational church. So it wasn't this contemporary, nothing like some of the contemporary worship churches we see today where they've got full-on rock bands and all of that. I'd get there eventually, but when I was growing up, I mean, every once in a while, my mom would be like, hey, can you bring your drums into church and play a little song? But it was not what I was into. So I would bounce around a little bit and go to some different churches in the city where I was living. And, I always thought it would be kind of cool, but I never really had a home in a place like that where I could get involved. Eventually, when I would find churches that had that kind of thing, I would do my best, but that wasn't really my focus. I just kind of wanted to go to church, hear a message and meet some people, but it really wasn't the focus of my life.
Sure.
Even though I would have said, yeah, I'm a Christian, I love Jesus, I wasn't pursuing that 100%.
Okay, so regarding church attendance, and by the way, Keith Nestor is in our Conversion Corner this morning, and I'm Gus Lloyd. Welcome to Seize the Day on the Catholic Channel on Sirius XM 129. During this phase of your life, Keith, when you love music, you're a drummer, you want to do rock and roll, did you always go to church, sometimes go to church, never go to church? How was that?
Well, I would say I most of the time went to church. So when I was I was 19 years old. I moved out to Philadelphia to play drums in a band out there, and I didn't know anybody. I got hooked up with this group, and a friend of mine worked with them, and I basically packed up a truck, all my stuff, drove to Philadelphia, knew nobody, and wound up auditioning for this band and got to be part of this group. But while I was there, I quickly realized how alone I felt. And I thought, the thing that would make me feel more at peace is if I could find a church. So I started, bouncing around completely alone, going to different churches, just trying to find a spiritual home. And I had some pretty interesting experiences doing that, walking into churches, ripped up jeans, leather jacket, walking in, people thinking I was there looking for money or something like that or whatever. And no, I'm just here trying to find, my faith, I guess.
Or a church home, maybe, right?
Yeah, a church home. Because I felt like I had a faith in Jesus, but I needed some fellowship. I needed some other people around to connect with.
Okay.
So I was going to church most of the time throughout that, but
it was never a particular church. Like you didn't seek out a Methodist church or
No.
What was that like? Just whatever church was close by, or how did that work?
Well, I kind of had this idea in my mind of what I wanted, and I didn't really care if it was Methodist or Presbyterian or Baptist or whatever. I wanted a place where I felt comfortable, and it was hard to find a church like that. Eventually I did, but it took some time, and sometimes I would go to 2 or 3 churches on a Sunday. I would just leave my house, drive around, and if I'd see a sign for a church, I'd stop in. And I was just looking for different things.
And a lot of times I know, Keith, I'm going to use a phrase here. I know you'll get, but I want to explore it just briefly. When you're in a situation like that, you're a young Protestant guy, you're looking around for a church. your church search is really based on sort of an ABC kind of thing. And by that, I mean anything but Catholic. Would that be fair to say?
Oh, yes, absolutely. There's no way in the world at this time of my life I would have ever even considered going to a Catholic church. I would have never in a million years.
Okay, tell me why. Why is that? Did you have preconceived notions about Catholicism? What did you hear about Catholicism when you were growing up, and what was it to you, if anything?
Well, first of all, I'll say this. I never heard much about it from my parents. Like my parents, I wasn't raised in like this anti-Catholic environment. It just wasn't a thing. What I thought Catholic was just another denomination of Christianity, okay? I had no concept of its place in history or as a foundation of what Christianity even is. To me, it was just another one of many denominations. And what I saw about it was it didn't resonate with my understanding of biblical Christianity at all. Now, granted, I didn't look into it very much, but I had, I grew up in the 80s and 90s, so there was a lot of I would say misinformation being pumped around in the popular Christian culture about Catholicism. I remember my dad gave me a book one time, and it had like a summary of different views of different groups of faith, Mormonism, Jehovah's Witnesses, and Roman Catholic was in there. And there was a chapter on what Catholics believe. And it was probably like a 3-page chapter. And they summed everything up according to their view, which wasn't a friendly view to the Catholic Church. And that's all I read, and that was it for me. So I thought the Catholic Church is about man-made traditions. It's about, institutionalized authority and not really anything centered on the Bible. And so I just never gave it a thought.
There you go. So it wasn't even a blip on your radar screen. You never would have even considered setting foot in a Catholic church. I mean, because it just wasn't a thing for you.
Yeah, it wasn't at all. And I was, music was so important to me that if I would have walked into a Catholic church and heard an organ and chanting, I would have been like, this is crazy. I'm out of here.
Forget about this noise. All right. So let me ask you then, Keith, but given your experience, anecdotally speaking, is that pretty common? Is the attitude that you had really common, especially in sort of the Protestant world? And by that I'm talking about that
absolutely.
That Catholicism is just another brand of Christianity. It's another denomination, and for most folks, it's one that would never even be an afterthought.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that, in my new life as a Catholic now, talking to a lot of people, and they will ask me, well, why Catholicism? There's so many different denominations. Why would you pick that one? And the first thing I usually tell people, Gus, is, you have to recognize the fact that Catholicism isn't a denomination. It's the foundation which everything else came from. So it's really impossible to look at Catholicism as a denomination because it's not, denominated from anything. It's the source.
Right.
But most people don't understand that.
Right. In fact, it's just the opposite. As you said, it's the coin is turned completely around in that everything denominated, if you will, from Catholicism. They all broke off at one time or another. Everyone was Catholic. The Catholic Church was it. That was the Christian church. And since that time, sometime starting with the Great Schism and then the Protestant Reformation, every other church has broken off of either Catholicism or something that broke off of Catholicism.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And I think that's one of the common misconceptions that I see more than anything else will be when people will say things like, well, the Catholic Church was started by Constantine in the 4th century. So your church is really a man-made tradition. And I mean, that's just plain not true.
Right.
But that type of false information is what most, I don't want to lump everybody together, Gus, but like most of what I hear in Protestants today, that when they want to talk to me about this, they have this fuzzy idea about the history of the church, and it usually includes this idea that the Catholic Church was started by Constantine in the 4th century, and before that, there was no Catholic Church. There were just Christians. And when you point out to people how untrue that is, if they'll listen, they'll be shocked and blown away. But a lot of people won't even listen, you know.
Yes, exactly. And it's so interesting. And I don't know, and I don't even know if you would know or remember this, but you remember you talked about how your dad gave you a little book that had a 3-page summary of Catholicism, et cetera. That may have even been in that little 3-page summary, you know, that, well, the Catholic Church began in 324 with Constantine, yada, 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 which again is patently false. But that's sort of the meme, if you will, that many of our Protestant brothers and sisters get about Catholicism and the roots of Catholicism. Let's kind of pick it up here, Keith, where your rock and roll days, I don't know if they necessarily come to an end completely, but you feel a call to ministry and you feel maybe a deeper calling in your life. Tell us about how that happened.
Yeah, so I was attending this church, and our pastor one night gave a sermon about Abraham and Isaac and how, you know, Abraham was called by God to let go of the thing that was the most important to him, which was his son Isaac, of course. And he related that story to us, which I'd heard before, but he challenged every person there to think about whatever things in their life were, you know, the most important thing. And, you know, I was basically convicted at that point in time. I mean, I felt like, okay, this is for me. And I remember praying a prayer that night saying, God, if you want me to do something different with my life, then that's okay with me. I will do it, but you've got to show me what it is. And I just had this sense at the time that something was going to happen, but of course I didn't know what to do. Well, then maybe it was a day or two later, I got a phone call from a friend of mine back in Iowa who I hadn't talked to in, you know, a few years actually, or a couple of years. And he was a Methodist pastor, and he said to me, hey, we need a youth pastor at our church. Would you be interested in something like that? And I mean, I'd never wanted to be a youth minister. I mean, I hardly ever even went to youth group, Gus. But I felt like, oh, this is it. This is what God is doing. He's calling me out. So I decided to go out and interview for this job, which I really didn't want. And I did my very best to bomb the interview, but they offered me the job, and I knew at that moment, I was like, okay, this must be what God has for me. So I came back to Philly. I, you know, quit the band, which was really hard because I loved being in that band, and you know, I said goodbye to my girlfriend at the time, and who is now my wife, by the way. But moved out to Iowa and started working in youth ministry.
I'm curious, Keith, what did you feel like the band was going anywhere? Did you think that maybe they could land a record contract or, you know, make it big?
Well, that was my hope. I mean, we did have an independent record contract. So we had a record that was out that we were working, and of course, you know, like 8 million other bands in the world, we thought that we were the next big thing. Mm-hmm. It was a great band, and I loved being a part of it. It was a tough thing to leave because that was what I had wanted to do for so long. I mean, that was the hope. But
sure. Well, and it's interesting to hear too about how you throw all these roadblocks up in the way, and yet God just knocks them all down. So you figured, okay, so this must be for me. All right, then tell us then about your career in ministry and how that progressed.
Well, okay, so I started in youth ministry, and, you know, our church that I was a part of was kind of a small to medium-sized neighborhood church, maybe 250 people, and our youth group had about 12 kids in it the first night that we got there. And within a couple years, it started to really grow. And eventually I was able to incorporate the music that I like to play and bring that as part of it. We started a rock and roll worship band for the students that turned into something pretty awesome. And our group like blew up to where we would have 250, 300 kids every Wednesday night coming to our youth worship night. And then the church just blew up after that, you know, and it was pretty awesome. And I was at that church for 13 years. And then, you know, eventually I decided that youth ministry wasn't really where I wanted to be. I took some time off from ministry for a little while in the church. We worked at a boys ranch out on the farm where we lived with some troubled teens. And then I started working in some smaller churches as a senior pastor. I worked in an evangelical free church for a little while, an Assemblies of God church. I kind of bounced around for a little while until about 8 years ago, I went back to the Methodist Church as a associate pastor of youth and mission. And while I was doing that, I began to preach and teach more to the adults and do more things. So, I mean, I was in ministry professionally for about 22 years.
Wow. So let me ask you, Keith, I'm curious
Sure.
about this. What, you said I believe you used the phrase bounce around. Okay. So you go an Assemblies of God church, a Methodist church here, and here. Why? Does it make any difference? And there are obviously differences. Otherwise they wouldn't be different denominations. So how does one justify going from one church to another and relating the differences that they have in theology or whatever the case may be? How does that work in your mind when you do that kind of thing?
Yeah. Okay. So that's a great point to talk about, because for me, I've always felt a little out of place in that world, because I never really felt like I fit in any one of those places. Now, the good things about the type of churches that I was associated with was, for a guy like me, was they were pretty loose. And what I mean by that is there weren't these hard and fast doctrinal rules or statements of faith that had to be strictly adhered to. You could sort of do your own thing theologically. Okay, you could get up and preach and teach, and if what you said wasn't exactly the same as one of the other pastors on staff or a church down the street of the same denomination, that wasn't the end of the world. I know there are some churches where it's not like that. Everyone has to think and believe and act the exact same way. But I never really wound up in those churches. So for me, if somebody would say to me, hey, will you come and work in this church? My decision would be more based on how do I fit into this local church, not so much a system of, belief for a denomination. So I always had this sense that, I was kind of floating around out there because it didn't really matter. You had the Bible and you had the Holy Spirit, and whatever God was leading you to talk about that day, you could talk about, and you just did the best you could. So for me to bounce around so much was, it was kind of a result of that.
Okay, would it be fair to say, because I hear often about this idea that, well, we agree on the essentials, and all this other stuff, well, it's all kind of negotiable. It's not really that important. Was that sort of the mindset?
Yeah, and that's ultimately, and I know we're going to get to this, but that's ultimately one of the things that God used to open my heart to Catholicism, was this idea of, essentials versus non-essentials. Because, it wasn't like I didn't have my theological opinions or my theological point of view, but whenever I would run into a disagreement or, some difference with someone else, and we would try to work that out, we would struggle. Because at the end of the day, all you have is the Bible and your own opinion on what you think it means. Yeah. So, and then when someone says, oh, well, that's not essential or this is essential, the question I would run into was, well, who gets to make that call? Who decides, is baptism essential or is it non-essential? Is, right. Marriage essential or non-essential? And those are just examples, but it's a really sticky topic when you don't have a divinely inspired list of what it means to have essentials.
Sure. And I like to put it like this, Keith. Whenever I talk to folks, and been doing this for a long time, I always like to say, at the bottom line, it's always about authority. There may be people who say, oh, well, I don't like the communion of saints. I don't like the fact that Catholic churches have statues or you worship Mary or all these things. But when you get down to the very core, the core issue is always about authority. So we'll cover that here in just a moment. First, tell me about then your first foray into Catholicism. When did the very notion of Catholicism enter into your life?
So it was probably about 1998, 97, 98-ish. My youth group was starting to grow, and I was trying to do a good job by making it, look cool to the kids, so they'd want to bring their friends and stuff. And I needed to find a logo for our youth group, and I started going through the Yellow Pages, and I found a graphic designer, and we had a conversation. And he invited me, he listened to me talk about my youth ministry, and then he invited me over to his house to talk about it. And so it was just a random thing. I went over to this guy's house, and when I walked up to his front door, I noticed he had all these statues everywhere in his yard. And it kind of threw me off because when I talked to him on the phone, I mean, he sounded like a Christian guy. We talked about Jesus a little bit, and he sounded excited about it. But yet I'm walking up to his house, and here's these statues.
Yeah.
And that was a little bit like, okay, then I thought, well, maybe this isn't even his house. Maybe he lives with his grandma or something. So I knocked on the guy's door. He opens the door. He lets me into his house. And his house, it literally looked like the church. I mean, he had holy water. He had statues. He had pictures of saints. And there's no television in his house. And and he was about my age, so I felt like I could relate to him. So we sit down and we start talking, and he shows me the designs for the logo, which were awesome. And then I just stopped him and I said, listen, I got to ask you a question. You seem like you're an on fire Christian, right? And he's like, oh, definitely. And I just said to him, well, what's with all this Catholic stuff? I don't get, and he just laughed.
Yeah.
And he's like, well, what do you mean? And I said, I don't understand it. I've never met anybody like you who says they love Jesus like this, but is a Catholic. What's that all about? And that led to a conversation where he just opened up to me about his Catholic faith in his life. And that night that I was over there, he handed me a VHS tape. That shows you how long ago this was. He says, you need to watch this. And the way he said it to me was, he said, here's a tape of a guy who was much like you, but way worse, and he became Catholic. And it was the Scott Hahn conversion story, and I had never heard of anything like that before. So I went home and I watched that conversion story of Scott Hahn, and it just, wow, it blew my mind. And then, so that led to this friendship with this guy who we would get together and talk about Catholicism and Protestantism. And I was still at the time convinced that Catholicism was wrong. So we would begin to discuss and argue and fight and debate about it back and forth. So I was trying to convince him that he needed to become Protestant. He was trying to convince me that I should become Catholic. And that was, really the beginning of that.
Sure. What a great story, too. And I got to tell you, Keith, it just makes me chuckle because I've run into this often where people meet a Jesus-loving, Bible-believing Catholic, and they think to themselves, wait a minute, this is such an oxymoron here. There's no such thing. You can't do that. And yet you met somebody just like that. I say thanks be to God. So tell me, as you began to consider Catholicism, what were like one or two of the biggest things, the biggest hurdles that you needed to get over?
Oh, man, it was everything. I mean, I thought that the idea of the papacy was ridiculous. I thought all the Mary stuff was out to lunch. Purgatory was, to me, that was like non-negotiable. There cannot be anything called purgatory because, Jesus died on the cross, save us from our sins. There's nothing more that needs to be added to that, right? That was my thought. So really, it was just about everything. But I would say for me, the biggest thing was, the authority piece like you talked about. And I thought that was kind of crazy. And remember, I still had all of this baggage from, my misinformed ideas about Catholicism. So a lot of what we did was he just corrected falsehoods. It wasn't so much, let me give you this argument. It was more like, let me just show you where what you think you know about Catholicism is actually untrue, which that was huge for me. And I think that continues to be a stumbling block for most Protestants. It's that what they think they know about the Catholic Church, in fact, isn't real. So they have this, they believe in this caricature of the Catholic Church, and then they put it down, but they haven't really understood the real teaching or belief of Catholicism.
Yeah, and I
so
know
we
that
would
for a
just
lot,
unpack all those things.
For a lot of folks, too, and it sounds like for you, Keith, as well, you were very reticent to believe this stuff. And I know that a lot of folks, let me run a quick scenario by you, because this is something that really happened to me because I had a journey where I was away from the church for a long time, and then I got into a Protestant church. And as I was, getting back into my Catholicism many years ago, one of our best friends was a PK as well. She was a preacher's kid. And so, I came at her with both barrels of my Catholic apologetics and whatnot. And one of the things that I didn't realize was what I was doing inadvertently, because I didn't know this, because she was a PK and her father had fed her all these lies about Catholicism for so many years, she felt like I was calling her dad a liar. Do you understand that? Do you know what I mean by that?
Yeah.
Is that a thing? Is that something that you maybe struggled with as well?
Well, I struggle with it now because I have 3 PKs in my family, my kids, and that's one of the things that we talk about now is because they aren't Catholic, and they will say to me things like, so is everything that you taught us when we were growing up, are you saying now that's a lie?
Wow.
And I mean, obviously that's a pretty harsh way to put it, but I think what you said is true, and what your friend said is true. It's like when you have a different view from somebody, and they've been taught a certain way, when you come against that, it can become a personal thing almost, to where,
sure,
well, if what you're saying is true, then you're telling me that I'm a liar, or that I'm wrong, or that I'm going to hell, or whatever. And that's a hard part of that conversation.
It is, and it is a harsh way to put it. And I think really maybe the correct way to put it would be I was ignorant. I mean, I was just ignorant about these things. I didn't know what I didn't know, and I believed the things that had been fed to me. And after, more research and looking into things, now I can't claim ignorance anymore. We're in the Conversion Corner. Keith Nestor is with us. Okay, so then tell us about your final jump to Catholicism.
Well, okay, so these are the original conversation I was having with my friend. These took place a long time ago, and there was a period where, I was really starting to feel convicted, and the objections I had were starting to become explained better to me. But it freaked me out, Gus. I mean, I was, you got to remember, I had 3 kids at the time, a wife, I had a career, all these things, and I thought to myself, well, I can't just become Catholic. What do I do? What would I do? And honestly, I just put it on the back burner. And there was a period of probably about, several years, I would say, where I just chose not to think about it. And it wasn't until, so I'm back in full-time ministry. This is probably about maybe 3 or 4 years ago. My denomination that I was in is going through some really tough stuff right now regarding, different issues in the culture and in the faith, and it's basically splintering apart. And the more I saw that, and the more I had conversations with people about that, the more I was recognizing how important authority is. And it was driving me back into these conversations about Catholicism. So in the middle of all that, I'm starting to feel led in this way, to be more open-hearted to the church. And I confessed to one of my other pastors, my senior pastor. I told him, I said, look, I think maybe God's calling me to become a Roman Catholic. And he said to me, okay, well, here's what we need to do. I want you to write and preach a sermon series in our church about the history and nature of the Christian church, And I thought, are you serious? You want me to do that? And he said, yeah. And I'm like, well, I'm not really sure that that's a good idea, because some of the things I might talk about might be, more Catholic in their belief. And he said, well, if that's the truth, we should hear it, shouldn't we?
Wow.
And I said, game on, man, let's do it. So I started preaching sermons about this stuff and looking into it even more, while at the same time I am, praying about it constantly and really struggling with the whole idea of authority. And it kind of came to a head to me one December. I preached a sermon series about the Blessed Virgin Mary receiving the news from the angel Gabriel that she was going to, give birth to Christ. And while I was preparing that sermon, I had like these really different emotional reactions to what was going on, things I've never really had happen to me before when writing a sermon around, the Blessed Virgin Mary. And it started to make me react emotionally. Like I'd be in my office writing this sermon, and I would start to tear up, or I would start to feel this interesting kind of, just leading toward this. And one of my Catholic friends came to visit me, and I told him about it. I said, I don't know what's going on with me, but something's happening with the Virgin Mary in my life. I don't know what to do. And he just broke down in my office, and he was like, oh my gosh, I can't believe you're telling me this. And he's like, we've been praying for you, and this is amazing. Well, I preached that sermon, and the church was like stunned by it. You know, people were so blown away by it in a good way. And I had people come up to me and say, I've never heard anything like that before. I've never heard anybody talk like this about her before. And, you know, I was beginning more and more to feel like, okay, this is what I have to do. Well, sort of the straw that broke the camel's back for me was I had an experience where I wound up, and I'm cutting to the chase here on this. I wound up in a church. In the morning, I had no idea this was going to happen to me that night. But that evening, I wound up in a church listening to a talk by Steve Ray. He was in this town in Illinois. And I walked into this church, knelt down in front of this crucifix, and I just was praying. And because they were having Mass, and I couldn't receive the Eucharist, but I went up for a blessing, and then I prayed. And I just prayed to the Lord. I said, God, if you want me to become Catholic and leave all this stuff behind, you know, I will do it, but you've got to make a way. You know, you've got to show me a way. Like, what am I going to do? What's life going to be? How am I going to take care of my family? I need a way. And, you know, as clearly as I've heard anything from the Lord in my life, I felt the Lord speak to me, and Jesus just said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. You don't need me to make a way. You just need me. And it just hit me, Gus. I was like, wow.
Yeah, wow.
And then so I went and sat down. Steve Ray gives this amazing talk about the early church and how they were willing to be martyred for the faith rather than compromise their faith. And, you know, meanwhile, everywhere I look in my own denomination, I'm seeing compromise. I'm seeing people abandon the faith. I'm seeing leaders that are just basically selling out to the culture. And then I go to this place and I hear about these early Christian martyrs, and then I'm looking at my own life and I'm going, what am I doing? You know, I feel like I believe Catholicism is true and I want to do it, but I'm not because I'm scared of losing a job.
Yeah.
How lame is that, right?
Yeah,
so
wow.
We go up and talk to Steve at the end of the talk, and my friend introduced me to him, and he says, this is Keith. He's a Protestant minister, and he's thinking about becoming Catholic. And Steve Ray just said to me, he goes, let me give you a piece of advice. He goes, you either need to become Catholic right now or turn around, run away, never read the church fathers, never think about it again. Because, you know, the Lord's after you in this, and you're going to go crazy. So it was that night on the way home, I think I told my wife, I called her and I said, we're doing this. Or when I got home, I told her that. And I went and told my church, and I said, listen, I need to resign. I'm going to become a Catholic. And no idea what to do, no plan on how we were going to live or anything like that. I just said, this is what I have to do. And they looked at me like I was crazy. I mean, our church was growing. We had a $9 million building that we were in the middle of constructing at the time, and things were happening. And they were like, what are you doing? This is crazy. But that was in 17, I think, October of 2017. And is when I came into the church, and man, I tell you what, it's been amazing.
Yeah. Well, I tell you,
but I had to get to that point, you know, where you
sure.
say, okay, I'll do this no matter what.
Yeah, there's always that sort of a point of no return. When you get to the bridge and you say, okay, I've either got to cross this bridge or, just like Steve Ray said, you know, turn around and never look back. Well, Keith, I'm just about out of time here. So if folks are interested in having you come and tell your story, which is just a beautiful and fascinating story, how can they get a hold of you?
Well, there's a couple ways, I guess. I mean, on YouTube, my YouTube channel is just called Keith Nestor, and they can go there and watch different videos. My conversion stories on there. My email address is just knestor@juno.com, and that's KNESTER @juno.com. I am working on a website. It's just going to be keithnestor.com, and folks can get a hold of me that way. And I'm on Facebook too.
That's fantastic. And what is God doing with you now? How's he using you now?
Well, it's been crazy because about a year ago, I really felt like God gave me this idea for, you know, a ministry and a book that I'm writing. And it's a book that's written for converts. And it's called The Convert's Guide to Roman Catholicism, Your First Year in the Church. So it's not necessarily like my conversion story, but it's a book written to people who are converting from a Protestant perspective, saying this is what life's going to be like for you as you join the church, and here's what you need to do in your first year. It's not like an apologetics book. or this theological manifesto type of a thing. It's more of a practical guide as you walk through it. Now, some of those things are in there, but that's not like the purpose of the book. The purpose is to help people who are converting when they step into the church to know how to navigate that. So I'm almost done with that. And then I just started posting videos on YouTube, and I've been blown away by what's happened. I mean, it's crazy. So I have that going on, but I work 2 jobs. I'm a guy just trying to
get by,
to live a holy life and get by and do my thing. And you know what? I have no regrets. I love where God's put me right now.
Well, praise God. Well, Keith, I got to tell you, brother, I'm honored to have you here on the program. Thank you for sharing your story with me, and may God continue to bless you and yours. I hope we'll get a chance to get together again sometime in the future. Keith Nestor in our Conversion Corner this morning. And if you would like more, just make sure and go to my website, GusLloyd.com, after the program today. Look up the Seize the Day page, and we'll give you some info about how you can find out more about Keith Nestor in our Conversion Corner.